I remember the exact moment the most powerful man in the city said he didn't want me. Not because he whispered it, not because it was meant to be private, but because he said it loudly enough for an entire ballroom to hear. I don't want her. I never did. Adrian Moretti's voice carried across the marble floor like a verdict. Conversation stopped. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Even the musicians seemed to hesitate for a breath before continuing their slow violin melody. I stood 10 feet behind him, close enough to see the slight tension in his shoulders, far enough that he didn't have to look at me when he said it. The chandeliers above us cast soft golden light across the grand hall, reflecting off polished floors and expensive suits, the kind of room where every watch probably cost more than my car. This was the world Adrian Moretti ruled. Quietly. Completely. Men twice his age stepped aside when he walked. Politicians shook his hand with careful smiles. And tonight, the leaders of two powerful families had gathered here for a single purpose. Peace. Or at least the appearance of it. And apparently, I was part of the deal. My name is Clara Whitmore, and 3 hours earlier I had been sitting in a quiet library on the Upper East Side, reading a novel and pretending my life still belonged to me. Now I was standing in the center of a negotiation that could determine the future of half the city's most powerful families. The room smelled faintly of expensive cologne and fresh flowers, but underneath it all was something harder to describe. Tension. The kind that lives beneath polite smiles and carefully chosen words. Across the room, several men exchanged glances after Adrian's statement. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked amused. One older man with silver hair cleared his throat softly, the way people do when they're trying to smooth over something awkward. Adrian, he said calmly. This arrangement was agreed upon. Adrian didn't turn around. He simply adjusted the cuff of his tailored black suit, his movements slow and precise, like someone who never rushed because the world always waited for him. Agreed upon doesn't mean wanted. His tone was controlled. Not angry. Not loud. Just certain. The kind of certainty that made people stop arguing. For the first time since he spoke, Adrian turned slightly, his dark eyes scanning the room with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. Those eyes passed over me without stopping, as if I were simply another detail in the background. A chair. A painting. Something placed in the room for convenience. I should have felt humiliated standing there. Any reasonable person probably would have. But strangely, I didn't. Because Adrian Moretti wasn't the first powerful man who thought he understood my role in his world. And he definitely wouldn't be the last to realize he was wrong. Outside the tall windows behind him, the lights of Manhattan stretched for miles, glowing against the dark sky like 1,000 quiet promises. Somewhere down there, people were walking home from work, ordering takeout, arguing about whose turn it was to do the dishes. Normal lives. Simple lives. Lives that had nothing to do with rooms like this one. I used to think that was the life I would have. But fate has a strange sense of humor. Because the man who had just declared he didn't want me was the same man who, without realizing it yet, was about to need me more than anyone else in this world. No one argued with Adrian Moretti when he used that tone. The older man who had spoken earlier slowly nodded, as if he had expected the resistance but hoped it would not come so quickly. Around the ballroom, conversations resumed in cautious murmurs, the soft sound of glasses touching and shoes moving across marble returning like a distant tide. The city called him influential. The people who truly understood how power worked simply called him careful. I stepped away from the center of the room and moved toward the tall windows overlooking the city. Manhattan spread out beneath the night sky like a living map, yellow lights glowing along avenues that ran straight for miles. A helicopter moved slowly across the skyline in the distance, its quiet hum barely audible through the glass. Somewhere far below, traffic moved in slow streams of red and white. Ordinary life continued as if nothing in this ballroom mattered. Perhaps that was the strangest part. Entire alliances could be negotiated in rooms like this, and the world outside would never notice. Footsteps approached behind me a few minutes later, calm and deliberate. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. Adrian stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see his reflection in the glass beside mine. Up close, the stories about him made more sense. Tall, composed, dark hair swept neatly back, the kind of presence that filled a room even when he stood perfectly still. Simple, he said calmly. You will stay here while the families finalize the terms. After that, You will move into the estate. There will be staff to assist you with anything you need. His gaze held mine steadily. And we will keep our lives separate. The words were not cruel. They were practical, efficient, like outlining the rules of a business contract. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The violin music drifted softly through the ballroom again, while the city lights continued glowing outside the windows. I nodded once more. That sounds very simple. Adrian studied my face for a second longer, as if searching for something he could not quite identify. Then he gave a small, satisfied nod and turned to rejoin the gathering across the room. He had made his position clear. The arrangement would move forward. And as far as he was concerned, the woman standing by the window would simply fit somewhere inside it. Neat line along the curb, engines idling quietly while drivers stood nearby in dark coats. The city air outside looked cold and clear. I rested my hand lightly against the glass and watched the street for a moment, letting the quiet settle in my chest. 3 hours earlier, I had been thinking about returning a library book before the due date. Now I was apparently preparing to move into one of the most private estates in the city. Life had a way of making sudden turns when powerful families started solving their problems with arrangements instead of conversations. The soft sound of footsteps approached from the direction of the ballroom again, lighter this time, and I turned to see an older woman walking toward me with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating rooms full of powerful men. Her silver hair was neatly styled, and her dark suit carried the subtle elegance of someone who understood exactly how authority looked when it did not need to be announced. She stopped a few feet away and offered a polite smile. "Miss Whitmore," she said warmly, her voice steady and professional. "I am Eleanor Hayes. I assist Mr. Moretti with the organization of his household. Estate would be many things. Peaceful might not be one of them." The drive to Adrian Moretti's estate took 40 minutes, though it felt longer because the city slowly disappeared behind us mile by mile, replaced by quieter roads and taller trees that lined the highway like silent guards. I sat in the back seat of the black sedan Eleanor Hayes had arranged, watching the lights of Manhattan fade in the rear window until the skyline looked less like a kingdom and more like a distant memory. The driver never spoke. Eleanor sat beside him in the front seat reviewing something on a tablet with the calm focus of someone used to managing complicated households. Outside the window the night stretched wide and quiet, the road curving gently through neighborhoods that grew larger and more private the farther we traveled from the city center. I had lived in New York long enough to understand what that meant. Distance was a luxury only the very powerful could afford. Eventually the car turned onto a long private road lined with tall iron lamps that cast warm pools of light across the pavement every 50 feet. The gates appeared ahead a moment later, tall wrought iron bars framed by stone pillars that probably weighed more than my entire apartment building. The gates opened before the driver even slowed down, as if someone had been watching our approach from far away. The car passed through quietly and continued up a long winding driveway that curved through acres of carefully maintained trees and gardens. It was not a house. It was an estate, the kind of place designed to exist separately from the rest of the world. When the main residence finally came into view, it rose from the hill like something from an old architectural magazine, wide stone walls, tall windows glowing softly from inside, and a sweeping staircase leading to a set of dark wooden doors. The driver parked near the entrance and stepped out to open my door before I could reach for the handle. The night air felt cooler than the city, carrying the faint scent of pine and fresh grass. Eleanor joined me beside the car and gestured toward the entrance with the gentle professionalism she had shown all evening. "Welcome to the Moretti estate," she said calmly. I followed her up the wide stone steps, my shoes echoing softly. Across the polished floor as the doors opened into a grand entry hall filled with warm golden light. The ceiling stretched at least 30 feet above us, supported by elegant arches that framed a wide staircase curving toward the upper level. Paintings hung along the walls, each one placed with careful symmetry, while tall windows overlooked the dark gardens beyond the house. It felt less like a home and more like a carefully designed world. Staff members moved quietly through the space with the silent efficiency of people who had worked here for years. A man in a dark suit nodded respectfully as we passed, while a young woman carrying folded linens stepped aside with a polite smile. No one stared. No one whispered. If they were surprised to see a new person entering the estate in the middle of the night, they hit it perfectly, between the trees like two quiet stars cutting through the darkness. The estate around me felt completely still, the kind of silence that only exists far away from the restless rhythm of the city. Somewhere deeper in the house, I could hear faint footsteps from the staff finishing their evening routines, doors closing softly, distant voices fading into quiet. For a moment, I wondered if he would simply continue down the hallway without acknowledging that I was here at all. That would have matched the tone he had set earlier in the ballroom. Instead, there was a gentle knock against the door. Not loud, not impatient, just a quiet signal that he had arrived. I crossed the room and opened the door slowly. Adrian stood in the corridor wearing the same dark suit he had worn earlier that evening, though the tension of the negotiations had softened slightly from his expression. The hallway light framed him in a warm glow that made the sharp lines of his features appear almost thoughtful. For a second, neither of us spoke. The silence between us felt different from the silence in the ballroom. Less formal, more curious. Adrian glanced briefly past me into the room before returning his gaze to my face. "You arrived safely," he said calmly, as if confirming a detail in a schedule he had already reviewed. I nodded. "Your staff made the trip very comfortable." He studied my expression for another quiet moment, perhaps expecting a complaint or a question about the arrangement we had discussed earlier. When none came, the faintest hint of curiosity appeared in his eyes. Adrian rested one hand lightly against the doorframe, his posture relaxed but attentive. "This estate is very private," he said evenly. "Many people find it difficult at first." His tone suggested he was offering information rather than comfort. I considered the room behind me, the quiet gardens outside the balcony, the stillness that seemed to wrap around the entire property like a shield. "It is quieter than Manhattan," I admitted softly. Adrian nodded once, as if that answer had confirmed something he had been observing all evening. Then he stepped back from the doorway and straightened his jacket with the same precise motion he had used earlier in the ballroom. "Get some rest tonight, Miss Whitmore," he said calmly. "Tomorrow we will discuss how this arrangement will function." And with that, Adrian Moretti turned and walked down the corridor, leaving the door open just long enough for me to realize something unexpected. For a man who had declared he did not want this arrangement, he had still come upstairs to make sure I was settled inside his world. The door closed softly after Adrian Moretti walked away, leaving the corridor silent again except for the fading sound of his footsteps moving deeper into the estate. I stood there for a moment with my hand still resting on the door handle, listening to that silence as if the house itself were breathing slowly around me. It was strange how quickly the night had changed. Only a few hours earlier, I had been standing in a crowded ballroom, surrounded by unfamiliar faces and careful negotiations. Now I was standing inside one of the most private homes in the city, watching the quiet hallway where the man who owned it had just disappeared. I closed the door gently and walked back toward the balcony window. The gardens outside stretched across the dark hillside like a quiet sea of shadows, broken only by soft pathway lights that curved between tall hedges and stone fountains. Somewhere far below, I could hear the faint sound of a door closing as Adrian finished speaking with someone in the lower hall. After that, the estate settled into a calm that felt almost deliberate, as if every room had agreed to rest at the same time. Sleep should have come easily after such a long night, but my mind refused to slow down. I sat in the reading chair beside the tall bookshelf and watched the flames move quietly inside the fireplace. Every once in a while the wood shifted with a soft crack, sending small sparks upward behind the glass screen. Eventually exhaustion won. The next thing I remember was sunlight touching my face through the balcony window. Morning had arrived quietly. The gardens outside were now filled with soft golden light, revealing rows of trimmed hedges and walking paths that wound between tall oak trees. Birds moved through the branches, their distant songs replacing the silence of the night before. For a moment I forgot where I was. Then the tall ceilings, the unfamiliar furniture, and the distant sound of movement somewhere in the house brought the memory back all at once. The arrangement. The estate. Adrian Moretti. I dressed and stepped into the corridor just as a young member of the staff passed by carrying a tray of fresh flowers. She greeted me with a polite smile before continuing down the hall toward the main staircase. The house felt different in the daylight. Warmer. Less mysterious. Sunlight poured through tall windows along the corridor, casting long shapes across the polished wooden floors. As I reached the top of the staircase, I could hear voices drifting up from the lower level. Questions first, he said. About the estate. About the families involved. About what exactly this arrangement means. I set the cup down quietly. Would the answers change the arrangement? Adrian paused briefly before shaking his head once. No. Then perhaps the questions can wait. A faint trace of something unexpected crossed his expression. It was not quite a smile, but it softened the sharp focus in his eyes for just a second. He leaned back slightly in his chair, folding his hands together on the table as if adjusting his thoughts. The estate operates on a simple rhythm, he said calmly. Most of the staff have been here for years. Eleanor manages the household and ensures everything runs smoothly. You will have complete access to the grounds and the library. If there is anything you need, you only have to ask. His tone carried the same practical clarity he had used when describing the arrangement the night before. It sounded less like an invitation and more like the explanation of a carefully structured system. And you? I asked quietly. Adrian glanced toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens before answering. My schedule changes often, he said. Some days I am here. Some days I am not. The work that supports the families involved in this agreement requires a great deal of attention. He spoke about it with the calm detachment of someone who had accepted responsibility long ago and stopped expecting anyone else to understand the details. For a moment, neither of us spoke again. The quiet between us felt natural rather than uncomfortable, as if the estate itself encouraged conversations to move slowly. Finally, Adrian stood and walked toward the window beside the table. Sunlight caught the edge of his dark hair as he looked out across the gardens below. There is one thing you should know, he said after a moment. People will watch this arrangement carefully. I joined him near the window and followed his gaze toward the winding paths between the trees. Because it keeps the peace, I said. Exactly. Adrian rested one hand lightly on the back of a nearby chair. Which means it must appear stable. There was something more complicated in his expression than calm authority. Something quieter. Almost reflective. Real peace is rarely created by arrangements, he said slowly. But sometimes arrangements create the space where peace can grow. The statement surprised me enough that I studied him more carefully. Adrian Moretti did not look like a man who spent much time thinking about peaceful things. Yet the way he said it sounded less like strategy and more like experience. He seemed to notice my curiosity and straightened slightly, returning to the composed posture he carried so naturally. Eleanor will show you the gardens after breakfast, he said. Many people enjoy walking there. I nodded once, glancing out toward the quiet paths between the tall trees. The estate felt calm in the morning light, almost untouched by the complicated agreements that had brought me here. As Adrian stepped away from the window and reached for the document he had been reviewing earlier, I realized something slowly beginning to change beneath the surface of our careful conversation. The man who had rejected this arrangement the night before was now explaining the rhythm of his world as if he expected me to remain inside it. The peaceful landscape. He values quiet spaces. Eleanor gave a small, thoughtful nod. More than most people realize. We continued along the path until we reached a shaded area beneath several tall oak trees. A wooden bench sat beside a small reflecting pool where the surface of the water moved gently in the breeze. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The estate felt completely separate from the rest of the world here, as if the city had been left miles away instead of just beyond the hills. You seem comfortable here already, Eleanor said after a moment. I considered the question carefully. Comfortable is not the word I would use yet, I admitted. But I understand the structure. Eleanor studied my expression with the quiet attention of someone who had observed many people adjusting to this place before. Structure can be helpful, she said gently, especially when circumstances change quickly. I glanced toward the distant main house where Adrian was likely still reviewing documents and planning conversations that affected families across the city. Does he always work this much? I asked. Eleanor's smile softened slightly. Mr. Moretti believes responsibility should be carried personally, she replied. That often means long hours. We resumed walking along the path, passing through another section of the garden where tall hedges framed a small greenhouse filled with bright green plants. The air smelled fresh and warm in the sunlight. As we turned a corner, I noticed something unusual near the far edge of the property. A young boy sat quietly on a stone wall beside the path, his legs swinging slightly above the grass while he looked down at a small wooden puzzle resting in his hands. He appeared to be about 8 years old, dressed in simple clothes that contrasted with the formal environment of the estate. When he noticed us approaching, he looked up with curious gray eyes, but did not move from the wall. Eleanor slowed her steps slightly beside me. "That is Daniel," she said softly. "He visits the estate sometimes with his mother. She works in the main house." I nodded politely as we reached the wall. The boy studied me for a moment before returning his attention to the puzzle pieces. I recognized the quiet concentration on his face immediately. It was the same focus I had seen many times before in children who found comfort in small, patient tasks. Without thinking, I stepped closer to the wall and crouched beside him. "That looks complicated," I said gently. Daniel glanced at me again and held up the puzzle piece he had been studying, as if silently asking whether it belonged somewhere specific. I smiled and pointed to the empty space in the wooden board where the shape seemed to fit. He slid the piece into place, and the small puzzle clicked together perfectly. Daniel's eyes brightened with quiet satisfaction before he looked back down at the board. Sound of the estate staff moving between the house and the greenhouse, but the activity felt far away from the quiet corner where Daniel and I sat. After a few minutes, the puzzle was complete. A small wooden image of a sailing boat rested across the board, carved with simple lines and smooth edges. Daniel ran his fingers across the finished shape with quiet satisfaction before carefully placing the final piece back into the small wooden box beside him. "Do you come here often?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "Sometimes. My mother helps in the kitchen when the house is busy." I glanced toward the main residence, visible through the trees. "Do you like it here?" Daniel thought about the question longer than I expected. Finally, he nodded again. "It is quiet," he said simply. The answer felt familiar. Quiet seemed to be the one thing everyone noticed about this place. Eleanor stepped closer then, her expression gentle as she addressed the boy. "Daniel, your mother will be finishing soon. You should return to the house." The boy slid down from the stone wall and picked up the puzzle box before giving me a small wave that felt both shy and sincere. "Thank you for helping," he said before walking back along the path toward the estate. I watched him disappear between the tall hedges before turning back to Eleanor. "He seems thoughtful," I said. Eleanor nodded softly. Daniel has always been observant. We continued walking through the gardens after that, following another path that curved around the reflecting pool and led toward a row of flowering trees near the edge of the property. As we approached the terrace again, I noticed a figure standing near the far balcony of the house, overlooking the gardens. Even at this distance, I recognized the posture immediately. Adrian Moretti stood near the railing with one hand resting against the stone edge, his attention directed toward the gardens below. For a moment, I wondered how long he had been there. From where he stood, the path near the oak trees was clearly visible, which meant he might have seen the entire interaction with Daniel. Adrian remained still for another second before turning away from the balcony and disappearing back into the house. Eleanor followed my gaze briefly before speaking with a small knowing smile. "Mr. Moretti notices more than people expect," she said quietly. As we stepped back onto the terrace, I could not help wondering what exactly Adrian Moretti had seen while watching the quiet corner of his estate that morning. The rest of the morning moved forward quietly after we returned to the terrace, but my thoughts remained on the balcony where Adrian Moretti had stood only minutes earlier. Eleanor Hayes seemed to sense the direction of my attention, but did not comment on it again. Instead, she guided me through the remaining sections of the garden with the calm patience of someone who had given the same tour many times before. We passed a greenhouse filled with herbs and citrus trees, then followed a curved path that led back toward the wide stone staircase connecting the gardens to the main residence. By the time we stepped inside the house again, the sun had climbed higher, filling the long hallways with warm light that reflected across polished floors and tall framed paintings. The estate no longer felt unfamiliar. It simply felt quiet. Eleanor excused herself to return to her responsibilities, leaving me alone near the central corridor. For a moment, I stood there listening to the distant sounds of the house. Somewhere a door closed gently. Somewhere else I could hear the faint murmur of staff speaking softly while preparing the midday meal. It was a calm rhythm, a controlled rhythm, the kind of rhythm that suggested every detail had been carefully arranged long before I arrived. I walked slowly toward the library Eleanor had mentioned earlier that morning. The large wooden doors opened easily, revealing a room filled with tall shelves of books that reached nearly to the ceiling. Sunlight streamed through wide windows overlooking the eastern gardens, illuminating a long reading table and several comfortable chairs arranged near a quiet fireplace. It felt like a place designed for long hours of quiet thinking. I stepped inside and ran my fingers lightly across the spine of one of the books, noticing that the collection ranged from history and philosophy to architecture and law. Whoever had chosen these books had done so with careful intention. I was scanning a shelf near the far wall when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "You found the library." Adrian Moretti stood in the doorway with the calm posture I had already come to recognize. He had removed his suit jacket since the morning meeting, leaving the sleeves of his white shirt rolled neatly to his forearms. The change made him look less formal, though the quiet authority in his presence remained exactly the same. I turned slightly to face him. "Eleanor mentioned it earlier," I said. Adrian stepped into the room, glancing briefly across the shelves before his attention returned to me. "Most people who visit the estate prefer the gardens," he said. "They rarely notice this room." I smiled faintly. "The gardens are beautiful, but books are quieter." Adrian studied that answer for a moment, as if considering it carefully. Then he walked toward the reading table and rested his hand lightly against the back of one of the chairs. "I saw you in the garden earlier," he said calmly. The statement was not a question. I nodded once. Daniel was finishing his puzzle. Adrian's expression softened slightly at the mention of the boy's name. "He likes those puzzles," he said. "They help him focus." The way Adrian spoke suggested that he had been paying closer attention to the small details of the morning than I had realized. I glanced toward the window where sunlight still filled the room with warmth. He seemed happy when he finished it. Adrian followed my gaze toward the garden outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said something that sounded almost reflective. "People are usually careful around this estate," he said quietly. "They watch what they say. They watch how they behave." He paused briefly before looking back at me. "You did not." The observation hung in the air between us. I considered his words carefully before answering. "Daniel was not watching the arrangement between families," I said gently. "He was solving a puzzle." Adrian held my gaze for another second before a quiet understanding seemed to pass across his expression. Then he nodded once and looked back toward the shelves of books. "Sometimes simple things are easier to solve than the arrangements adults create," he said. And for the first time since I had arrived at the estate, Adrian Moretti sounded less like a man explaining a strategy and more like someone quietly acknowledging a truth. Adrian's words lingered in the quiet library after he spoke them, and for a moment neither of us moved. Sunlight continued to pour through the tall windows, lighting the rows of books and casting long reflections across the polished floor. The room felt calmer than the conversations that had brought me to this estate, and perhaps that was why Adrian had chosen to follow me here instead of returning immediately to his work. He walked slowly along one of the shelves, his fingertips brushing lightly against the spines of several books, as if confirming they were still exactly where he expected them to be. "Most people who visit this house try to impress me," he said after a moment. "They speak carefully. They choose every word as if it were part of a negotiation." I leaned lightly against the edge of the reading table and watched him move along the shelves. "And does it work?" Adrian glanced toward me with a faint, thoughtful expression. "Rarely," he answered. "People who try too hard usually reveal more than they intend." He stopped beside one of the taller shelves and pulled out a book bound in dark leather before returning to the table. The title was unfamiliar to me, something about leadership and the long history of political alliances. Adrian set the book down, but did not open it immediately. Instead, he rested both hands on the edge of the table and looked at the sunlight drifting across the pages. "The families who arranged this agreement believe it will stabilize several situations in the city," he said calmly. "They expect both of us to behave as if we support the decision completely." I nodded slightly. "Appears stable, calm, intentional." Adrian looked up at me again, recognizing his own words from earlier that morning. "Exactly." There was a pause before he spoke again. "You do not seem particularly concerned about the expectations attached to this arrangement." I considered that carefully before answering. "Concern will not change them," I said quietly. Adrian studied my face again with the same careful attention he had shown several times throughout the day. "You adjust quickly," he said. "Most people would still be asking questions about why they were brought here." I turned slightly toward the window where the gardens stretched out beneath the bright afternoon sky. Somewhere beyond the trees, Daniel was probably helping his mother finish her work for the day, his puzzle already returned to its wooden box. Sometimes the reason becomes clearer after you observe the situation for a while, I replied. Adrian followed my gaze toward the garden before speaking again. Observation can be useful, he admitted, but it can also reveal complications. His tone carried a quiet meaning that seemed to stretch beyond the simple conversation we were having. I looked back at him. Complications are part of every arrangement. Adrian gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the truth of that statement. Then he picked up the book he had placed on the table and finally opened it, glancing briefly across the first page before closing it again. You will notice changes in how people behave around the estate over the next few days, he said. News travels quickly in the circles connected to my work. I understood what he meant. The announcement made in that ballroom the night before would already be moving through conversations across the city. Families would be watching closely to see how this arrangement unfolded. I walked toward the tall window beside the table and looked out across the quiet gardens once more. The estate still appeared peaceful from here, untouched by the complicated expectations forming beyond its gates. Adrian joined me beside the window after a moment, his reflection appearing faintly in the glass beside mine. The arrangement may have been created for strategy, he said slowly, but how it develops from here will depend on something simpler. I turned slightly toward him. What is that? Adrian looked out toward the gardens again before answering. Whether two people inside the arrangement decide to treat it like a prison or like an opportunity. The quiet certainty in his voice suggested he had been thinking about that question far longer than he wanted anyone else to know. Adrian's reflection remained beside mine in the tall library window for a moment after he finished speaking, the afternoon sunlight outlining the calm lines of his expression while the gardens outside continued their quiet rhythm. His words about prison and opportunity settled into the silence between us in a way that suggested he had not spoken them lightly. For a man who seemed to calculate every conversation with careful precision, the thought carried an unusual weight. I watched the distant paths of the garden where sunlight filtered through the oak branches, and I considered the difference between a place that held you and a place that gave you room to breathe. Opportunities usually require trust, I said softly. Adrian did not respond immediately. Instead, he folded his arms loosely and leaned one shoulder against the window frame, his attention still directed toward the trees outside. Trust is rarely offered freely in my world, he replied after a moment. It is observed first. I nodded slightly, understanding what he meant. The estate itself reflected that philosophy. Every corridor was calm, every routine precise. Even the people who worked here moved with quiet awareness, as if they understood that small details mattered more than loud gestures. Observation takes time, I said. Adrian glanced toward me again, the thoughtful expression returning briefly to his eyes. Time is one of the few things powerful families believe they cannot afford, he said, which is why they prefer arrangements. The quiet honesty of that statement surprised me enough that I smiled faintly. Adrian noticed the reaction and lifted an eyebrow slightly. Something amusing? He asked. Not amusing, I replied. Just honest. Adrian considered that answer carefully before pushing himself away from the window and walking slowly toward the long table again. The book he had opened earlier still rested where he left it, untouched. He closed it gently and placed it back on the shelf beside the door, as if deciding that whatever answers it contained could wait for another day. There will be a gathering here tomorrow evening, he said calmly. Several representatives from the families involved in the arrangement will visit the estate. I turned toward him to observe the stability of the agreement. Adrian nodded once. Exactly. His tone suggested that he expected the evening to unfold with the same careful structure that governed every other part of the estate. Eleanor will prepare the house, he continued. Most of the conversations will remain formal, predictable. He paused slightly before finishing the thought. But people will watch how we behave. I understood the meaning behind that statement without needing further explanation. In the ballroom the night before, Adrian had openly rejected the arrangement. Tomorrow evening, the same families would expect to see something very different. I walked toward the center of the library where the sunlight created a warm pool of light across the wooden floor. Then perhaps we should give them something simple to observe, I said. Adrian looked at me curiously. Simple. I nodded. Calm. Intentional. Just as you described. For a moment Adrian studied my expression again, searching for the reasoning behind my words. Then something subtle shifted in his posture. Not agreement exactly, but recognition. You adapt quickly, he said quietly. Sometimes adaptation is the only way to understand a situation, I replied. Adrian stepped closer to the window again, looking out across the gardens where the late afternoon light had begun to soften into warmer colors. Somewhere near the far path, I could see the stone wall where Daniel had finished his puzzle earlier that day. The place looked peaceful, almost untouched by the complicated decisions that had drawn us both here. Adrian followed my gaze toward that same corner of the garden before speaking again. Peaceful appearances often hide complicated foundations, he said. That is true everywhere. I nodded slowly, understanding that he was no longer speaking only about the estate or the gathering planned for the next evening. Outside the tall windows the sun began its slow descent behind the trees, and the quiet house seemed to pause for a moment between one chapter of the day and the next. Standing beside Adrian Moretti in that calm library, I realized something that had not been clear the night before in the crowded ballroom. The arrangement might have brought me to this estate, but the choices made inside it were only beginning to unfold. The late afternoon light faded slowly from the library windows, leaving the room wrapped in a softer golden glow as the sun moved behind the distant hills beyond the estate. Adrian Moretti remained beside the tall window for several moments after our conversation ended, his attention resting somewhere beyond the gardens where the stone paths curved quietly through the trees. The silence between us no longer felt uncertain. It felt thoughtful, like the quiet pause that comes before the beginning of something neither person had fully planned. Eventually Adrian stepped away from the glass and turned toward the center of the room. Eleanor will begin preparing the house shortly, he said calmly. The gathering tomorrow will bring many observers. I nodded once. Then tonight will be the last quiet evening for a while. Adrian allowed the faintest hint of agreement to pass across his expression. Most likely. He walked toward the door of the library but paused before leaving, his hand resting lightly on the frame as he glanced back toward me. You handled the first day here better than most people would have, he said. The statement was simple, but the sincerity behind it surprised me more than the words themselves. I smiled slightly. Your estate makes it easier than you think. Adrian considered that answer before stepping into the corridor. It was designed that way, he replied. The quiet sound of his footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving the library peaceful once again. I remained by the window for another minute, watching the last traces of sunlight disappear from the garden paths. Somewhere in the distance a few lights began to appear along the edges of the grounds, small lanterns illuminating the walkways as evening settled over the estate. The house seemed to shift with the change of light. Staff members moved quietly through the halls preparing dinner. The distant sound of dishes and low conversation drifted through the open doorway. The estate was waking into its evening rhythm. I eventually left the library and walked slowly back toward the central staircase. As I reached the top step, I noticed Adrian standing in the entrance hall below speaking with Eleanor Hayes. Their conversation ended quickly when he noticed me descending the stairs. Eleanor excused herself with a polite nod and disappeared down one of the side corridors, leaving Adrian waiting near the base of the staircase. The warm lights of the entrance hall reflected across the marble floor as I reached the final step. Adrian looked slightly different in the evening light. Less distant, more thoughtful. Dinner will be ready soon, he said calmly. I glanced around the quiet hall, noticing how the large space felt less imposing than it had the night before. Your house feels different at night, I said. Adrian followed my gaze toward the tall windows that now reflected only the soft glow of the interior lights. The estate becomes quieter after sunset, he replied. Most of the outside world stays beyond the gates. For a moment we both stood there in the calm center of the house, listening to the quiet rhythm of the evening settling around us. It was strange how quickly the unfamiliar had begun to feel almost natural. Adrian finally broke the silence with a thoughtful expression that seemed to hold more honesty than the careful conversations from the ballroom the night before. Yesterday evening I believed this arrangement would only create complications, he admitted quietly. I looked at him with mild curiosity. And now? Adrian's gaze held mine for a long moment before he answered. Now I think it may reveal something unexpected. The words lingered gently in the warm air of the entrance hall while the estate lights glowed softly around us. Somewhere outside the tall windows, the garden paths remained calm beneath the evening sky, the same quiet place where a small puzzle had been solved earlier that morning. And standing there beside Adrian Moretti in the peaceful heart of the house, I began to understand something that neither of us had recognized when the arrangement was first announced. Sometimes the choices that feel like obligations at the beginning slowly become the moments that change everything.